Today, we are navigating, well, one of the most tangled financial scandals in Australian history. We're talking about the Trio Capital fraud.
Often called the country's largest superannuation fraud. A huge deal.
Absolutely huge. And our mission today, it isn't just about retelling the story of the fraud itself, massive as it was.
No, we want to peel back the layers, really understand how it was even allowed to happen, what warnings were missed.
And some, frankly, surprising connections that have largely stayed out of the public eye. We're digging into parliamentary reports, financial blogs, detailed accounts.
Yeah, a whole mix of sources. The goal is to give you a clearer, sort of more informed picture. We'll guide you through it, highlight the surprising bits, give you the context.
Think of it as your shortcut to really getting up to speed on a case that, well, it raises some big questions about accountability, transparency, and finance.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in. Where did the first alarm bells start ringing?
Okay, so the first publicly known warning sign about the suspected fraud in Absolute Alpha, that was the fund before it became Trio Capital's big Astara strategic fund.
Right.
That came from John Hempton. He's the CIO, Chief Investment Officer of Bronte Capital.
And he revealed this when?
In January 2010, he said he'd actually tipped off the Sydney Morning Herald 6 months earlier. So back around July 2009.
6 months earlier. Okay. And the Herald followed up.
They did. And this is where a really crucial mistake happened. The Herald asked the fund's custodian bank to verify Astara's assets, check if they're real.
Standard procedure, you'd hope.
Exactly. But the bank, well, initially they told the Herald the assets were safely held with them. All good.
Oh boy, so that reassurance.
It basically stopped the investigation in its tracks. Both the Herald and Hempton halted their digging, totally unaware it was based on bad info.
And the timing of this. Wow. We don't know the exact date the Herald asked the bank.
No, the exact date isn't clear, but it was during this period of really rapid growth for the fund, sort of the lead up to September 2009.
And sources are saying if the custodian had just been a bit more careful then.
The claim is pretty stark. Had the custodian paid closer attention right then, the fraud could potentially have been stopped. Millions in Aussie retirement savings saved.
Just incredible. Did the bank ever correct itself?
They did eventually. They apparently discovered the mistake and contacted the Herald to, withdraw that initial statement. But
it was too late. The damage was done.
Yeah, exactly. What's also really telling is that the 2012 Parliamentary Joint Committee report on the Trio fraud, it doesn't even comment on Hempton's experience here.
Doesn't mention it.
Nope. And later, in 2016, Trio victims tried Freedom of Information requests asking APRA and ASIC for documents about this incorrect bank information. Nothing. The agencies apparently said the documents couldn't be found or just didn't exist.
Okay, let's just unpack this for a second. What really stands out to you about how this early warning was handled? It just seems fundamentally flawed.
It really does. What stands out is how a single slip-up, by someone who's supposed to be a gatekeeper, custodian bank, it can just completely neutralize a valid warning. This uncorrected mistake wasn't just a small error. It feels like it was a fatal flaw. It cost millions. It really makes you question how much responsibility do these custodians have, especially when their initial say-so turns out to be so wrong.
That is the big question, isn't it? But thankfully, Hempton, he wasn't totally put off by that wrong information. His gut was still telling him something wasn't right.
That's right. Even 6 months after that initial incorrect reassurance from the bank via the Herald, he was still worried, still digging.
So what kept him going? What was he seeing?
It seems his drive came from this link he perceived, a connection between Absolute Alpha and another fund called Paradigm Global.
Paradigm Global, okay.
And by September 2009, so just a couple of months after his initial tip-off attempt, he felt strongly enough to actually tell his friend Ken Henry about it.
Ken Henry, the Treasury Secretary at the time.
The very same. And Hempton didn't stop there. He formalized his concerns in a letter, sent it straight to the ASIC chairman, Tony D'Aloisio.
So he went right to the top of the regulator. And this Paradigm Global, you said it had a link.
Yes. And what's really fascinating, or maybe alarming, is that Paradigm Global itself had, let's say, a checkered history. It wasn't exactly a clean operation.
Okay, tell us more about that. What kind of history are we talking about?
Well, for starters, it wasn't shy of legal battles. There were multiple lawsuits in the New York Supreme Court involving Paradigm.
Like what?
For instance, there was one in 2007, Lotito versus Hunter and James Biden and Paradigm. It involved accusations about irregularities in a deal to buy Paradigm.
Hunter and James Biden. So the then vice president's son and brother.
Correct. And there was another suit running from around 2002 to 2008. This involves Stefan Feruz, who was Deutsche Bank's global head of fund derivatives at the time.
And what was that about?
Feruz sued James and Hunter Biden, alleging he was defrauded when they agreed to buy his interests in Paradigm. So, serious allegations flying around.
It definitely paints a picture, not just simple business disagreements.
Not at all. And there's more. Around 2007-2008, Paradigm actually shared an office with another firm called Ponte Negra.
Okay, and Ponte Negra.
Ponte Negra was later found to have used false data to basically force the return of ill-gotten gains. It's a process called disgorgement. So, not great company to keep, perhaps.
No, it doesn't sound like it.
And then James and Hunter Biden liquidated Paradigm in 2010. They returned money to investors. But here's the thing.
What's that?
This detail, the liquidation and return of funds, apparently wasn't notified to the trio victims, and those victims also didn't get an accurate picture of the transactions between Astara and Paradigm.
So, more missing information for the people actually affected by Trio.
Seems that way. And there's one more connection that's pretty startling.
One.
Paradigm had also operated with Stanford Capital Management.
Wait, the Stanford? Alan Stanford?
The very same, the hedge fund owned by Alan Stanford, who got convicted in 2012 for running that massive, $8 billion Ponzi scheme, one of the biggest ever in the U.S.
Wow. So Paradigm was connected to the Bidens, shared an office with a firm caught using false data, and worked with Alan Stanford's operation.
That's the picture painted by the sources, yes. And remember, at the time, the fund involved members of the sitting vice president's family.
Okay, so Hampton raises concerns about the link to this fund with its history, sends a letter to ASIC. What happens?
Well, the 2012 Parliamentary Joint Committee report, the PJC report we mentioned, it did acknowledge Mr. Hampton's persistence. They gave him credit for that.
There's a but coming, I feel.
There is. The only mention of the Hunter Biden Fund, Paradigm, was basically buried in a footnote.
A footnote. Given all those connections and Hampton's specific warning?
Just a footnote. And the sources we've looked at argue that the sort of official story about Trio Capital just doesn't mention the Bidens at all. It suggests a real lack of transparency, maybe information being deliberately kept hidden.
This is where it gets really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have these seemingly separate threads, Trio, Hampton's warning, this Paradigm Fund with its own trouble history, links to politically connected figures.
Exactly. And they start to weave together. If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, why would these details end up in a footnote? It really begs the question about what story was being told officially and what was being left out.
It certainly does. And that official silence, maybe that footnote approach, is kind of why we need to pull back the curtain even more, because these connections, especially around Hunter Biden, they didn't just stop with Paradigm Global, did they?
No, they didn't. The financial dealings became much more public knowledge later on, particularly with the well-known 2014 laptop incident.
Right, the laptop scandal.
Yep.
That brought a lot of attention to Hunter Biden's business ventures.
It did. Many people will remember he joined the board of Burisma. That's the Ukrainian energy company owned by the oligarch Mykola Zlochevsky. And reports say he was paid millions for that board seat.
And the White House at the time, what did they say?
Back in 2014, when he joined Burisma, the official White House line was pretty clear. I think the quote was something like, Hunter Biden and other members of the Biden family are obviously private citizens, and where they work does not reflect an endorsement by the administration or by the vice president or president.
Okay, drawing a line between family business and official duties.
That was the stated position. Then fast forward to 2020, and the laptop records became public news. These showed international business dealings, financial transactions.
What kind of transactions?
Well, the records apparently revealed a lot of wire transfers. Some had traceable addresses, but many seemed to involve anonymous shell companies, often run out of lawyers' offices, moving money from places like Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, places known for financial secrecy.
Shell companies with no real employees? Fuzzy paper trails.
Pretty much. And the source material is clear. Based on those records alone, there's really no way to tell definitively if all that money was legitimate consulting fees or if it involved something illicit like money laundering or tax fraud. It's ambiguous from the records themselves.
Okay, so that's the broader context. How does this connect back specifically to Trio Capital?
Here's the direct alleged link. According to staff who worked at Trio, Sean Richard, he was a really key figure in the Trio Capital fraud.
Right, Sean Richard. We'll hear more about him later.
Yes. According to these staff, Richard had a close relationship with Hunter Biden. They're talking frequent phone calls, emails. Richard even reportedly visited Hunter in New York several times.
A close relationship. That's a significant claim.
It is. And just to add another layer to this picture of finance, influence, and high-value transactions around Hunter Biden, remember the art situation.
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
In September 2021, the White House actually issued a formal ethics agreement. It was for a gallery that was exhibiting Hunter Biden's artwork.
An ethics agreement for an art exhibition.
Yeah. It was specifically designed to try and prevent influence peddling. There were concerns that buyers might pay these really high prices for the art, not because of its intrinsic value, but to potentially curry favor with his father, the president.
What kind of prices are we talking?
The reports mentioned figures like $75,000 for works on paper and up to $500,000, $500,000 for paintings, prices that certainly raised eyebrows.
Okay, so bringing all this together, Burisma, the laptop details, the alleged close relationship with Sean Richard from Trio, the art sales.
Okay.
What does this wider context tell us? Why is it relevant to understanding Trio?
Well, I think it raises important questions about the worlds these people moved in. You have finance, politics, international business, potential influence. It's all intertwined. For the Trio story, it suggests that the key figures, like Sean Richard, weren't just operating in some isolated Australian bubble. They were allegedly connected into this complex international network. And that network itself had a documented history of, let's say, questionable financial dealings and legal scrutiny.
So it adds another dimension. It suggests Absolute Alpha, later Astara Strategic, wasn't just a standalone bad apple, but maybe part of a more problematic ecosystem.
That's certainly the picture that emerges from putting these sources together. It hints at a context that might have made such a large-scale fraud, perhaps, easier to operate within or harder to detect initially.
A very complex picture indeed. And speaking of complexity, let's shift gears a bit now. Let's talk about the regulators and the custodians, the people and institutions supposed to prevent this sort of thing. Their roles seem, well, let's just say there are some contradictory views.
That's putting it mildly. There are definitely conflicting perspectives on who was responsible for what.
Okay, let's start with ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. What do they say their job is?
Well, if you look at ASIC's own website, it states pretty clearly, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, ASIC regulates banks and financial service providers, sets and enforces banking standards, and investigates and acts against misconduct in the banking sector.
It sounds comprehensive. Regulate, set standards, enforce, investigate, act against misconduct. Pretty clear mandate.
Seems so, doesn't it? But then, let's look at what the Parliamentary Joint Committee, the PJC, said in their 2012 report about the role of custodians. Remember, custodians hold the assets.
Right. What was the PJC's take?
Their position, well, it appeared to have accepted that the custodians had no obligation. That's a direct quote from analysis of their report.
No obligation. How do they justify that?
They wrote things like, the custodian does not have the expertise to question underlying values of either domestic or offshore funds.
So they just hold it? They don't need to know if it's actually worth anything?
That seems to be the implication. They also wrote, and this is quite striking, the custodian does virtually nothing to protect the funds of investors.
Virtually nothing.
That's what the PJC report suggested. It continued. It makes no independent checks before transferring money offshore. Instead, the custodian simply acts on the instructions of the responsible entity, basically just following orders.
Wow. That sounds incredibly passive, almost like a rubber stamp.
It certainly paints a picture of a very limited, almost box-ticking role, a stark contrast to maybe what an ordinary investor might assume a custodian does.
Definitely. Okay, so that's the PJC's view from 2012. Now, you mentioned contrasting views. What's the other side?
Well, fast forward to 2018, the Banking Royal Commission is happening, putting banks under the microscope. And Trio victims asked ANZ's chief executive officer, Mr. Shane Elliott, a direct question.
What did they ask him?
They asked if the Trio custodian, which happened to be an ANZ entity, was exempt from the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing laws, the AML-CTF laws. This was specifically about that huge sum, $194.5 million, that went overseas from Trio.
Okay, a very direct question about legal obligations. What did Elliott say?
His response was unequivocal. He stated, and this is a direct quote from his response, ANZ is not exempt from AML-CTF laws and is required to, and does, meet its reporting obligations to AUSTRAC, including the obligation to report all cross-border funds transfers.
So completely the opposite of the PJC's apparent stance. He's saying, yes, we absolutely have these obligations under law, and we meet them.
Precisely. He explicitly affirmed their responsibility under those key anti-money laundering laws. A very different tune to the PJC's description of custodians doing virtually nothing to protect funds or check transfers.
So what does this all mean? How can you have these two, fundamentally opposing views on what a custodian is supposed to do? One saying no obligation, no expertise. The other saying, yes, legal obligation, we meet it.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It points to this significant ambiguity or maybe even a disconnect in how responsibilities are understood or perhaps applied in practice.
And what's the impact of that disconnect?
Well, in real terms for investors, it creates confusion and potentially false security. You might think certain checks and balances are firmly in place based on, say, the bank CEO's statement. But then an official inquiry suggests those checks are minimal or non-existent.
It's like regulatory Schrodinger's cat. The protection both exists and doesn't exist until something goes wrong.
Kind of. And that ambiguity, that regulatory gray area, it's exactly the sort of environment where sophisticated fraud, like Trio, can unfortunately find space to grow and thrive. It exploits the gaps between stated rules, expected practices, and actual enforcement.
Which leads us perfectly into the next point.
Yeah.
The actual failures in intervention and enforcement. It wasn't just ambiguity. There were clear signals missed, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. Multiple red flags seem to have been raised and apparently ignored or not acted upon effectively.
Let's go through some of them. Where did things start to go wrong internally?
Well, as early as 2004, there was already an alleged breach of the Corporations Act by Sean Richard. Remember him, the key Trio figure?
Yes. What was the breach about?
It was over a conflict of interest. That specific issue, conflicts of interest, seems to be a recurring theme.
Okay, so that's 2004. What happened next?
In 2005, things escalated. A director on the board of one of the Astara funds actually wrote a formal complaint letter, sent it to the main Trio board.
And what did the letter say?
It specifically mentioned, again, conflicts of interest. This wasn't just a quiet word. It was a formal written complaint, a major red flag.
And crucially, what was happening around the same time?
This is where it gets really concerning. At the exact time this letter landed, APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, was actually conducting a prudential review of Trio. They were in there looking at the books, supposedly.
So APRA was on site while the board received a letter warning about conflicts of interest.
Precisely. And the person who wrote that letter, they were reportedly satisfied at the time, thinking, okay, APRA's here, they'll deal with these problems.
But they didn't.
Turns out, no. 8 years later, that same letter writer discovered their warning had apparently made zero difference. Nothing changed.
That's staggering. APRA knew, or should have known, and nothing happened.
It gets worse. In 2006, according to the sources, APRA itself concluded that the Trio directors were, and this is a quote attributed to APRA findings, a bunch of incompetence.
A bunch of incompetence. That's APRA's own assessment.
Apparently so. And this wasn't based on a quick look. APRA had conducted 4 or 5 prudential reviews of Trio during its 5-year operation. They kept looking, kept finding issues.
But did they do anything? Shut them down, warn people.
Despite finding them incompetent, APRA took no decisive action. They didn't inform or warn creditors, investors, anyone.
Why not? What was their reasoning?
According to APRA's Ross Jones at the time, they claimed they had no obligation to inform the market.
No obligation to warn the public about incompetent managers handling potentially billions in retirement funds. It just beggars belief.
It really does. It points to a very passive or perhaps legally constrained view of their own powers or duties at the time.
Okay, so internal warnings ignored, regulator finds incompetence but doesn't act.
Yeah.
What about the money itself? Were suspicious transactions picked up?
Well, here's another major point. There was one huge transfer. It wasn't cash. It was an in-species transfer, meaning assets were moved directly.
How big?
Over $50 million, sent directly to a foreign tax haven.
$50 million. To a tax haven. That sounds inherently suspicious. Surely that triggered alarms.
You would think so. Under AML-CTF law, that kind of transaction would typically require a suspicious transaction report, an STR, to be lodged with AUSTRAC, the Financial Intelligence Unit.
And was one lodged?
According to the sources, there is no evidence that an STR was ever lodged for this massive transfer.
No STR. For $50 million going offshore to a tax haven.
That's the claim. And what's more, during the official Trio investigation period, roughly 2010 to 2012, The regulators, ASIC, APRA, and OSTRAC apparently didn't even ask questions about this specific $50 million transfer. It just seems to have slipped through the cracks.
How is that even possible? Wasn't OSTRAC supposed to be looking for exactly this kind of thing?
Well, remember what the PJC report said. The Parliamentary Joint Committee stated the committee did not receive a submission or take direct evidence from OSTRAC.
They didn't even hear from OSTRAC directly.
Apparently not. And the PJC added, it does appear, however, that OSTRAC was not given any significant information from the various gatekeepers alerting it to suspicious activity in Trio Capital.
So the gatekeepers, like the custodian, maybe the fund managers, didn't tell OSTRAC, and OSTRAC didn't proactively find it or wasn't asked about it. It's a complete system breakdown.
It really looks like a systemic failure from multiple angles. Information wasn't flowing, warnings weren't heeded, suspicious activity wasn't reported or investigated.
Okay, let's try and make sense of this. You've got all these alarm bells, internal complaints, APRA finding incompetence, this huge unreported transfer. Why did the system fail so spectacularly to act?
That's the core question, isn't it? It seems like a combination of factors. Maybe a narrow interpretation of responsibility by each body, lack of coordination between agencies, perhaps insufficient tools or powers, or maybe just an unwillingness to act decisively.
Whatever the reason, the consequences were devastating for the investors who lost their savings.
Absolutely devastating. And it really highlights that having multiple regulators doesn't guarantee protection if they aren't communicating effectively, aren't acting on red flags, or if there are gaps in who is responsible for what.
Which brings us, inevitably, to ASIC's accountability in all this, and the public's right to know what really went on.
Yes. Ultimately, Sean Richard was convicted. A New South Wales Supreme Court judge found him guilty of dishonest conduct while running a financial services business.
So justice was served in that sense.
Well, yes, he was convicted. But the sources we're drawing on raise serious questions about how he got into that position in the first place. They state Richard lied to pretty much everybody.
Lied about what?
Lied to consumers, obviously, but also, crucially, lied to ASIC itself about his qualifications.
He lied on his application to the regulator.
That's the assertion. And here's the really critical part. ASIC reportedly issued Richard his Australian Financial Services license, his AFS license,
Yes.
without properly checking his qualifications or his background.
They didn't verify his credentials before giving him a license to handle other people's money.
According to the source, no. And the source claims this failure, this lack of basic due diligence by the regulator, effectively rolled out the welcome mat for Richard. It allowed him entry into the financial sector where he could then orchestrate the theft of Australian retirement savings.
That's a damning assessment. It suggests ASIC's own processes, or lack thereof, directly enabled the fraud.
It's a very strong claim, yes. It fundamentally questions whether ASIC was fulfilling its role to protect the public in this instance. The source goes further, actually.
How so?
It states there's no indication that ASIC served the interests of the people in the Trio matter, and that the information ASIC withheld from the public.
What information was withheld?
The specifics aren't fully detailed in the summary, but the claim is that withholding some information undermined the understanding of the Trio fraud. And, very importantly, it wrongly made consumers appear to be outside of the law.
Made the victims appear outside the law?
The implication seems to be that by not revealing the full picture, perhaps including regulatory failings or the complexities we've discussed, the narrative might have shifted blame towards investors for choosing the fund, rather than focusing on the systemic failures that allowed it.
That's a really serious point. And there's one more allegation here, isn't there? About politicization.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most serious allegation raised by the source material. It claims that the legal placement of consumers' retirement savings into the financial system was undermined, that their rights were essentially demolished by the politicization of the Trio crime by a directive to ASIC from a politician.
The directive from a politician to ASIC, influencing how a crime was handled.
That is the explosive claim made in the source material we reviewed. It suggests political interference directly impacting the regulatory response and the rights of the victims.
We need to be clear here, this is a very serious allegation from the sources we've synthesized. We're reporting what they claim, not verifying it ourselves. But if true, the implications are enormous.
Absolutely enormous. It strikes at the very heart of regulatory independence and the rule of law. The core takeaway here is the potential consequence when information is withheld, or when regulatory duties are allegedly compromised. It doesn't just allow fraud, it can potentially erode public trust entirely and even distort the legal standing of those affected.
So what does this all mean for the public's trust in financial oversight?
Yeah.
And maybe more practically, for you, the individual investor trying to navigate this world?
It paints a really vivid and frankly quite concerning picture. It shows the potential consequences when there are gaps in oversight, when warnings go unheeded, when information might be suppressed, or when regulatory bodies perhaps don't fulfill their mandates as expected.
Okay. We have covered a lot of ground today. We've taken a real deep dive into this labyrinth of the trio capital fraud.
We really have. And what's emerged is this story, not just of a fraud, but of missed warnings, of alleged regulatory failures, these surprising and complex international connections involving some very powerful figures.
Yeah, from that very first mistaken bank statement that, threw investigators off the trail.
All the way through to this tangled web of offshore dealings, legal fights, connections to figures like the Bidens, Alan Stanford. It really shows how complex these things can be.
Definitely not a simple, straightforward case of one bad actor.
Far from it. And I think, considering the sheer number of signals that seem to have been missed, the alleged shortcomings of the regulators, the custodians, and these hidden connections we've brought to light today.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this deep dive truly tell us about how robust our financial oversight systems actually are?
And maybe more importantly, where does accountability ultimately lie when something this big goes wrong? When ordinary people's retirement savings just vanish?
And maybe a final thought for you listening. As you navigate your own financial world, how can you apply the lessons from this story? Lessons about transparency, about asking questions, about doing your own due diligence. How do you protect yourself in a system that, as this case suggests, might have some significant cracks?
It's a lot to think about. Definitely food for thought about the systems designed, supposedly, to protect us all.